Section 10 of Diary of a U-Boat Commander. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Diary of a U-Boat Commander by Stephen King Hall. Section 10. I have just had to stop recording my experiences of the past 48 hours, as the navigator, who is on watch, sent down a message to say that smoke was in sight. The next hour was full of anxiety, but by hauling off to port we managed to lose it. I then had a little food, and I will now conclude my account before trying again to get some sleep. New entry. The account continued. All my hopes of getting up again that night, both for the purpose of charging and getting the 3 a.m. signal, were doomed to be disappointed, as the hydrophone operator kept on reporting the noise of destroyers overhead. Occasional distant thuds seemed to indicate a never-ending supply of depth charges, but they were about 4 or 5 miles from me. Perhaps some other unfortunate devil was going through the fires of hell. At daylight on the second day my position was still miserable. The battery was getting low again, the sea had gone down, and when I put my periscope up at 9 a.m. the horizon seemed to be ringed with patrols. I felt as if I was in an invisible net, and though I endeavoured to conceal my apprehension from the crew, I could see from the listless way they went about their duties that they realized that once again we were near the end of our resources. All the forenoon we crept along at 30 metres, until the tension was broken at 1 p.m. by a furious depth-charge attack. In some extraordinary way they had located me again, and closed in upon me. The first charges were some little distance off, and as they got closer a feeling of desperation overcame me, and I seriously contemplated ending the agony by surfacing and fighting to the last with my gun. Curiously enough, the procedure that I adopted was the exact opposite. I decided to dive deep. I went down to 114 metres. At this exceptional depth 3 rivets in the pressure hole began to leak, and jets of water with the rigidity of bars of iron shot into the boat. I held on for 5 minutes, which was sufficient to save me from the depth-charge attack, though 2 which went off almost above me broke some lamps. I then came up to 20 metres and slowly crawled on. Throughout the long afternoon, though we were not directly attacked again, I heard depth charges on several occasions, sufficiently close to me to demonstrate that these implacable and tireless devils had an idea of the area I was in. By a supreme effort, working one motor at the only speed it would go, dead slow, I managed to squeeze out the battery until I estimated it must be dusk. There was only one thing to do. I surfaced. It was not as dark as I had hoped, and I saw a fairly large sloop-like vessel about 8,000 metres away on the port beam. She must have seen me simultaneously, as the flash of a gun darted from her, the shell falling short. I couldn't dive. There seemed only one thing to do: fight, and then die. I ordered the gun's crew up, and the unequal duel began. We were going full speed on the diesels, and my course was east by north. A good deal of water and spray was flying over the gun, and my crew had little hope of doing much accurate shooting, but I have often found that when one is being fired at there is nothing so comforting as the sound of one's own gun. Our enemy was armed with 2 large guns, 15 centimetres or over, but had no speed, a discovery which raised my hopes again. It was soon evident that, provided we were not heading for another patrol, if we could survive 10 minutes' shelling, we should be saved for the time being by the fading light, which was evidently causing our enemy increasing difficulties, as his shots alternated between very short and very much over. I was actually congratulating the navigator on our escape, and I had just told the gun's crew to cease firing at the blurred outlines on the port quarter from which the random shells still came, when there was a sheet of yellow flame and a jar which threw me against the signalman. The latter had been standing near the conning tower hatch, and unfortunately I knocked him off his balance, and he fell with a thud into the upper conning tower. He had the good fortune to escape with a couple of ribs broken, but when I recovered myself and got to my feet, far worse consequences met my eyes. By the worst of ill luck, a shell which must have been fired practically at random had hit the gun just below the port trunnion. The result of the explosion was very severe. 4 of the 7 men at the gun had been blown overboard. The breech worker was uninjured, though from the way he swayed about it was evident that he was dazed, and I expected to see him fall over the side at any moment. The remaining 2 men were as dead as horseflesh. The material damage was even more serious. The gun had been practically thrown out of its cradle, but in the main the trunnion blocks had held firm, and the whole pedestal had been carried over to starboard. The really terrible effects of this injury were not apparent at first sight, but I soon realized them, for an hour later we had shaken off the sloop. I saw a red flame on the horizon, which plainly indicated flaming at the funnel from some destroyer, doubtless looking for us at high speed. I dived, intending to surface again as soon as possible. With this intention in my head I did not go below the upper conning tower. We had barely got to 10 metres, when loud cries from below and the disquieting noise of rushing water told me that something was wrong. I blew all tanks, surfaced, left the first lieutenant on watch, and went below. There were 5 centimetres of water on the battery boards, and I understood at once that we could never dive again. For the pedestal of the gun, in being forced over, had strained the longitudinal seam of the pressure hole to which it is bolted, and a shower of water had come through as soon as we got under. It might have been hoped that this was enough, but no, our cup was not yet full. Chlorine gas suddenly began to fill the fore end. The salt water running down into the battery tanks had found acid, and though I ordered quantities of soda to be put down into the tank, it became, and still is at the moment of writing, impossible to move forward of the conning tower without putting on a gas mask and oxygen helmet. So we are helpless, and at the mercy of any little trawler, or even the weather. We have no gun. We cannot dive. The English must know that they have hit us, and every hour I expect to see the hull of a destroyer climb over the horizon astern. We are fortunate in 2 respects, in that for the time being the weather seems to promise well, and our diesels are thoroughly sound. We are ordered to Zeebrugge. I could have wished elsewhere for many reasons, but it does not matter, as I cannot believe we are intended to escape. I feel I would almost welcome an enemy ship. It would soon be over. But this uncertainty and anxiety drags on for hour after hour, and now I cannot sleep, though I haven't slept properly for over 70 hours. I am so worn out that my body screams for sleep, but it is denied to me, and so, lest I go mad, I write. It is better to do this, though my eyes ache and the letters seem to wriggle, than to stand up on the bridge looking for the smoke of our enemies, or to lie in my bunk and count the revolutions of the diesels, thousands of thudding beats, one after the other, relentless hammer strokes. I have endured much. Note by Etienne. A break occurs in Karl von Schenk's diary at this juncture. Fortunately, the main outlines of the story are preserved owing to Zoe's long letter, which was in a small packet inside the cover of the second notebook. Zoe's letter will be reproduced in this book in its proper chronological position, but in order to save the reader the trouble of reading the book from the letter back to this point, a brief summary of what took place is given here. The entries in his diary which follow the words, "I have endured much," are very meagre for a period which seems to have been about a month in length. There was no further mention of the latter stages of Karl's passage in the wrecked boat to Zeebrugge, so it is presumed that he made that port without further adventure. He was evidently on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and appears to have been suffering from very severe insomnia. He had been hunted for 2 days, during which he was perpetually on the verge of destruction, and the cumulative effect of such an experience is bound to leave its mark on the strongest man. When he got back to Zeebrugge he must have been at the end of his tether, and whether by chance or design it was when Karl was, as he would have said, at a low mental ebb, that Zoe made her last and successful attack upon his resolution not to see her again unless she consented to marry him. It is plain from her letter that when he left her after the stormy interview in which he vowed never to see her again, Zoe did not lose hope. She seems to have kept herself au courant with his movements, and actually to have known when he was expected in. We know that she had many friends amongst the officers, and it is probable that from one of these she was able to get information about Karl's movements. Bruges was probably a hotbed of U-boat gossip, and, not unlike the conditions at certain other naval ports during the war, the ladies were often too well informed. At any rate, it appears that Zoe rushed to see Karl directly he arrived at Bruges, and found him a mental and physical wreck, suffering from acute insomnia. With the impetuous vigour which evidently guided most of her actions, she took complete charge of Karl, and as he was due for 4 days' leave, she whisked him off to the forest. Karl may have protested, but was probably in no state to wish to do so. At her shooting box in the forest, Zoe achieved her desire, and the stubborn struggle between the lovers ended in victory for the woman. There is an entry in Karl's diary which may refer to this period. He simply says, "Slept at last. Oh, what a joy!" If this entry was written in the forest, it seems as if Karl had been unable to sleep until Zoe carried him off to the forest peace of her shooting box, and surrounded him with the atmosphere of her tender sympathy. There is no evidence of the light in which Karl viewed his defeat, when, having regained his strength, he was able to take stock of the changed situation. It is reasonable to suppose that his silence upon this matter in the pages of his diary is evidence that he was ashamed of what he must have considered a great act of weakness on his part. At all events, he realized that he had crossed the Rubicon and that he had better acquiesce in the fait accompli. He seems to have been in the harbour for about 6 weeks, during which he lived with Zoe, and the lovers enjoyed a brief spell of happiness before Karl set out on his next trip. Karl seems to have found those 6 weeks very pleasant ones, though his diary merely contains brief references, such as "A day in the country with Z." "Z and I went to the cavalry dance," and other trivial entries. Of his thoughts there is not a word. About the end of 1917 Karl's boat was repaired, and he left for the Atlantic, and once more resumed full entries in his diary. Signed, Etienne. Karl's diary resumed. Sailed at 9 p.m. last night, and we are now 17 miles off Beachy Head. The Straits of Dover were frightful. The glare of the acetylene flares on the barrage showed for miles. Seen from a distance, it gave me the impression of the gates of hell, through which we had to pass. I dived 10 miles away, and went through with the tide at a depth of 40 metres. 2 hours and 3/4 of suspense, and at dawn we came up, having passed safely through the great death trap. At the moment there is nothing in sight, except a little smoke on the horizon. I am going to dive again until dusk. New entry, 2 a.m. We are thrashing down the channel with a southwesterly wind right ahead. My instructions are to work for 2 days between the Lizard and Kinsale Head, and then proceed far out into the Atlantic, where the convoys are supposed to meet the destroyers. That Fair Island Channel experience was enough for a lifetime. Death, quick, short and sudden, this I am ready for. But torture, slow, long, and drawn out, is not in the bargain which in this year of grace every civilized man and half the savages of the world seem to have had to make with the god Mars. As I sit in this steel, cigar-shaped mass of machinery, the question rings incessantly in my ears. To what object is all this war directed, when analysed from the point of view of the individual? It does not satisfy any longing of mine. I have not got a lust for battle. No one who fights has a lust for battle. editors of newspapers, and people on general staffs, possibly also cabinet ministers, have lust for battles, as long as they arrange the battle and talk about it afterwards. Curse them. The only thing I want is to be with Zoe. I want to live and spend long years with her, enjoying life, this life of which I have spent half already, and now perhaps it will be taken from me by some other man, some Englishman, who doesn't really want to take my life, reckoned as an individual. Around me in the darkness are the patrol boats, manned by the Englishmen who are seeking my life. Seeking it, not to gratify their private emotions, but because we are all in the whirlpool of war and cannot escape. Like an avalanche, it seems to gather strength and speed as it rolls on, this war of nations. The world must be mad. I cannot see how it can ever stop. England will never be defeated at sea. We shall conquer on land. Then what? An inconclusive peace. Even if we smash this island empire and gain the dominion of the world, how will it advantage me? I can see no way in which I can gain. It would be said, if any one should read this, Gott! What a selfish point of view. He thinks only of his personal gain, not of his country. But confound it all, I reply, answer me this. Do I exist for my country, or does my country exist for me? For example, does man live for the sake of the Church, or was the Church created for man? Does not my country exist for my benefit? Surely it is so. Then again, I am risking my all, my life. I live in danger, apprehension, and great discomfort. I do all these things, and yet if as a reasonable man I ponder what advantage I am to gain from all these sacrifices, I am adjudged selfish. It is all madness. I cannot fathom the meaning of these things. New entry. In position on the Bristol line of approach. The weather is bad. New entry. At 20 meters. Once again Death has stretched forth his bony fingers to catch me by the throat, and only by a chance have I wriggled free. Yesterday afternoon at 5 p.m. we sighted a small steamer flying Spanish colours and steering for Cardiff. The weather was choppy, but not too bad, and I decided to exercise the gun's crew, though I did not think there would be much doing, as the Spaniards soon give in. I opened fire at 6,000 meters, and pitched a shell ahead of her and ran up the signal to heave to. The wretched little craft paid no attention, and continued on her lumbering course. I suspected the presence of an Englishman on her bridge, and determined to hit. This we did with our 6th shot, and she stopped dead and wallowed in the trough, with clouds of steam pouring out of her engine-room. We had evidently got the engine-room. As we closed her, it was evident that a tremendous panic was taking place on board. The port sea boat was being launched, but one fall broke and the occupants fell into the water. My navigator begged me to give her another, which I did, and hit her right aft. 2 boatloads of gesticulating individuals now appeared from the shelter of her lee side, and began pulling wildly away from the ship. The navigator, whose eyes were dancing with excitement, was very keen to play with them by spraying the water with machine-gun bullets, but it seemed to me to be waste of ammunition, and I would not permit it. Meanwhile we had approached to within about 400 meters of her port bow. I was debating whether to accelerate her sinking, when I noticed that a fire had broken out aft, and I became possessed with a childish curiosity to see the fire being put out as she sank. It was a kind of contest between the elements. As I watched her, I was startled to hear 3 or 4 reports from the region of the fire. "Ammunition!" shouted the pilot with wide-opened eyes. In an instant I pressed the diving alarm, as I realized our deadly peril. Fool that I had been, she was a decoy ship. She must have realized on board that I had seen through their disguise, for as we began to move forward, under the motors, a trap-door near her bows fell down, the white ensign was broken at the fore, and a 4-inch gun opened fire from the embrasure that was revealed on her side. We were fortunate in that our conning tower was already right ahead of the enemy, and as I dropped down into the conning tower, I saw that as she could not turn we were safe. A few shells plunged harmlessly into the water near our stern, and then we were under. We came up to a periscope depth, and I surveyed her from a position off her stern. She was sinking fast, but I felt so furious at being nearly trapped that I could not resist giving her a torpedo. Detonation was complete, and a mass of wreckage shot into the air as the hull of the ship disappeared. As to the two boats, I left them to make the best course to land that they could. As they were 50 miles off the shore when I left them and it blew force 6 a few hours afterwards, I rather think they have joined the list of missing. We are now steering due west to our second position. New entry. Received orders last night to return to base forthwith on the north about route. Footnote. This means into the North Sea round Scotland. End of footnote. I have shaped course to pass 50 miles north of Muckleflugga. No more Fair Island Channel for me. New entry. Statlandlet in sight, with the Norwegian coast looking very lovely under the snow. We never saw a ship from north of the Shetlands to this place, when we saw a light cruiser of the Town class steaming southwest at high speed. She had probably been on patrol off this place, where the inner and outer leads join up, and ships have to leave the 3-mile limit. She was well away from me, and an attack would have been useless. I did not shed any tears. I have lost much of the fire-eating ideas which filled my mind when I first joined this service. New entry. We are due off the Mole at 8 p.m. tonight, and my heart leaps with joy at the thought of seeing my Zoe. Already I can almost imagine her lovely arms round my neck, her face raised to mine, and all the other wonderful things that make her so glorious in my eyes. End of section.